I asked one very reasonable question at a restaurant hostess stand, and somehow by the time we got to our table, Dan was whispering my name like it was a weather alert, which was unnecessary. I did not yell. I did not threaten anyone. I did not climb over the little wooden podium and reorganize the seating chart myself, although based on the way people reacted, you would think I had arrived with graph paper, a whistle, and a personal vendetta against appetizers. I simply asked whether the waitlist was being managed emotionally. And I still think that was a fair question. This happened Friday night at a neighborhood restaurant Dan likes because they serve bread in a small metal basket. And apparently that is all it takes for him to trust an institution. We arrived at 6:18, which is a very normal time to arrive for dinner if a restaurant understands civilization. There were people waiting near the entrance, but not a frightening amount. Maybe 3 groups, maybe 4. Depending on whether you count the man standing near the decorative plant pretending not to listen to everyone. The hostess smiled and said, "It'll be about 35 minutes. 35, not 30, not 40. 35, which sounds precise until you realize precision can be used to make vague systems feel official." I said, "All right, and is the waitlist first come? First served?" She said, Mostly. That is not a system, that is a feeling wearing a name tag." Dan gave me a look immediately, because Dan has known me long enough to sense when a word has entered my bloodstream. I ignored the look because marriage is not a muzzle. I said, "Mostly meaning what, exactly?" The hostess said, "We seat based on party size, table availability, reservations, and timing." Now that sounds reasonable if you do not think about it. But if every factor can change the order, then what exactly is a list? At that point, it is not a list, it is a suggestion with chairs nearby. If you appreciate basic public systems, subscribe. Because apparently asking how a waitlist works is now considered creating tension near a fern. We stepped aside. I was calm, I was patient, I was hungry, yes, but hunger does not erase structure. Hunger actually reveals who has structure. I checked the time on my phone, 6:21. I remember because I took a screenshot, not for legal reasons, just to maintain reality. At 6:27, a couple walked in, spoke to the hostess for maybe 12 seconds, and were seated immediately. They did not even have the posture of people who had waited. There is a certain softness in the shoulders of someone who has earned a table. These people looked fresh, unseasoned by delay. I said to Dan, "They just got seated," Dan said. "Maybe they had a reservation," I said. "Then she should have said reservations override the list." He said, "She did mention reservations," I said. "She hid it inside a cluster of variables." Dan looked at the ceiling, which is where he stores his patience. At 6:33, a family of 4 was seated. We were 2 people. Now, I understand a 4-top is different from a 2-top. I am not new to rectangles, but the family had arrived after us, and one of them was still deciding whether they even wanted to eat there. I could tell from the way they studied the menu outside. That is not commitment. That is browsing with shoes. So I walked back to the hostess stand. Calmly, I said, "Hi, just checking. Are we still at 35 minutes? She said, "Yes, probably about 20 more." "Probably." There it was again, I said. "So the 35 minutes is flexible." She said, "It's an estimate." I said, "Then may I ask if the list is being managed chronologically, spatially, or emotionally?" She blinked. I do not think she was confused by the words. I think she was surprised someone finally named the problem. She said, "Emotionally?" I said, "Yes." Meaning, are certain parties being seated because they seem easier, happier, more festive, less likely to ask follow-up questions? Dan appeared beside me and said, "We're fine," I said. "Dan, I'm gathering information," the hostess said. "We seat based on table availability." I said, "That is spatial, thank you. But I'm asking whether emotional ease is also a factor." Behind us, someone coughed in a way that was clearly a laugh wearing a jacket. Tell me in the comments, because I genuinely want to understand when asking for the logic of a waitlist became more disruptive than the waitlist having no visible logic. The hostess said, "No, we don't seat people emotionally." I said, "Good. Then we should be close." She looked at the tablet. "You're next for a 2-top next." A beautiful word. I returned to Dan and said, "We are next." Dan said, "Great. Please let that be enough." And for a moment it was. Then at 6:41, two women came in, hugged the hostess, and were taken to a table by the window. Now, I did not assume corruption. I noticed warmth. Warmth is not corruption, but it can create conditions where corruption feels polite. I said they hugged her. Dan said, maybe they know her. I said, that is exactly what I'm saying. Dan said, knowing someone is not illegal. I said, legal and appropriate are not always seated at the same table. He closed his eyes. I returned to the hostess stand. She saw me coming and did the smile people use when they are trying to remain employed. I said, hi again. Quick clarification. Are personal relationships part of the seating algorithm? She said they had a reservation. I said, did they? She turned the tablet slightly away from me. That was interesting. I was not trying to look at confidential information. I was trying to understand whether the invisible list controlling my dinner was based on time, space, or vibes. She said, ma'am, we promise we have you on the list, ma'am. Once someone says ma'am in that tone, they have stopped hearing your words and started managing your shape. I said, I appreciate that. But being on the list and being respected by the list are two separate experiences. If you think a waitlist should behave like a list, hit the like button, because apparently that belief now requires bravery and comfortable shoes. A manager came over. I did not ask for a manager, which I want recorded. He arrived naturally like a storm cloud in a button-down shirt. He said, is everything okay? I said, that depends on how your waitlist is governed. Dan whispered, oh my God. The manager said, we're doing our best to seat everyone as quickly as possible. I said, I'm sure you are. My concern is methodology. He explained that reservations, party size, server rotation, table turnover, and seating sections all affect wait times. Again, very polished, very restaurant school, but notice how every explanation involved a reason the list could be ignored. I said, so it is less a wait list and more a wait suggestion. The man near the plant made a sound. Dan put a hand on my elbow and said, we can go somewhere else. I said, absolutely not. We have already invested 26 minutes. That is called sunk cost with principles. Finally, at 6:49, the hostess said, your table is ready. Wonderful, except it was not by the window. It was not near the middle. It was near the hallway to the restrooms, tucked beside a decorative wall covered in fake wine bottles. Now, was that technically a table? Yes. Was it emotionally placed? Also, yes. I said, interesting. Dan said, do not. I said, interesting. He said, you said it with punctuation. We sat. The server came over, perfectly polite, and asked if we wanted water. I said yes. Dan said yes. Then I asked whether table assignments were randomized after waitlist disputes. The server paused. Dan's soul left his body briefly. The server said, I'm not sure. I said, that's fine, I'm just noticing a pattern. Dan said, there is no pattern. I said, we are next to fake bottles, Dan. The bread came, and I will admit the bread was good. Not enough to erase process concerns, but good enough to complicate the evening. Halfway through dinner, I saw the hugging women laughing by the window. Window seats. Natural light. Joy. Meanwhile, I was watching people enter and exit the restroom hallway with the regularity of train service. I did not say anything for 11 minutes. I want credit for that. Then Dan said, please stop looking at the hostess stand. I said, I'm not looking at it. I'm oriented toward it. He said, your whole body is oriented toward it. I said, that is because our table was placed in a monitoring adjacent position. He put down his fork and said, this is dinner. I said, this is also data. At the end of the meal, the manager stopped by and asked, how was everything? Dangerous question. Dan said, great. I said, the food was good. The manager smiled, thinking he had survived. Then I said, the seating journey, however, raised questions. Dan stared at the fake wine bottles like they might adopt him. I explained calmly that a customer should be able to understand whether a wait list is chronological, spatial, reservation-based, or emotionally influenced by friendliness, familiarity, and low-maintenance energy. The manager said, we definitely don't seat emotionally. I said, then I would recommend avoiding emotionally suggestive outcomes. He nodded slowly, which is what people do when they want a conversation to end without admitting it had content. When we left, the hostess said, have a good night. Very sweet, very professional. But I noticed she did not say, "Thank you for helping us clarify the language around the waitlist." That would have been mature. In the car, Dan said, "You asked a restaurant if the waitlist had feelings." I said no. I asked if people were using feelings to manage it. He said, "You said emotionally." I said because that was the shortest accurate word. Later that night, I posted in the neighborhood chat. Question: should a restaurant waitlist be first come, first served, unless clearly explained otherwise? Ryan replied, "Why does this feel like you terrorized a hostess?" I wrote. I asked one systems question. Rebecca wrote, "What did Dan do?" I wrote, "Dan ate bread." Marcy sent a photo of her dog sitting beside a tiny chalkboard that said, "Reserved." I'm not saying the dog is becoming part of the problem, but the timing is no longer accidental. The next morning, I checked the restaurant reviews, not to leave one, just to understand patterns. Several people mentioned the wait. One person said the hostess was sweet. Sweet is nice. Sweet is not a seating policy. I did not write a review. That is restraint. But I did draft one in my notes app titled, "Good Bread, Unclear Governance." I may never post it. Sometimes documentation is personal. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because next time I will explain why my neighbor's wind chimes were not just making sound, they were creating an atmosphere. As for the restaurant, I stand by my question. A wait list should wait and list. Those are the two words. If a system has exceptions, fine, but name them. If reservations matter, say so. If table size matters, explain it. If hugging the hostess creates suspiciously fast window seating, do not act shocked when someone with eyes notices the emotional temperature of the room. People can laugh. People can say, "I overreacted." People can pretend they have never silently judged a restaurant host stand while holding one of those little vibrating squares like a hostage. But we were told 35 minutes. We watched people move ahead. We got the fake bottle hallway. And everyone wants to enjoy the benefits of order while mocking the only person brave enough to ask if the order has a mood. My side of the story, obviously.